even the slightest Indian sign bore out the redskin reports that the country was taboo and recalled their superstitions, that it was haunted by a race of prehistoric troglodytes, or Nokonis, as they called them, with repulsive gargoyle-like faces who lived in caves cut from the living rock creatures, reported to be twice the size of ordinary humans, who never missed a chance to carry off unwary hunters or stray squaws in their powerful, gorilla-like arms. Philip H. Godsall, The Curse of Dead Man's Valley, 1950. In the northernmost regions of Canada lies a vast area known as the Northwest Territories, a virtually uninhabited stretch of land. To put it into perspective, imagine Germany, a country with a population of about 83 million people. The Northwest Territories are more than 4 times the size of Germany, yet their population at any given time is a mere 50,000 people. Beyond its vastness and sparse population, the region remains almost entirely wild, with dense forests, towering mountains, and expansive rivers and lakes. For even the most seasoned adventurers, the Northwest Territories represent a truly perilous environment, with one section being particularly hazardous. Situated at the heart of this land is the Nahanni Valley, an 11,000 square mile expanse of untamed wilderness. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was designated a national park. But don't be misled. This is not a place where you can casually go hiking or camp with your family. There are no tourist facilities and no roads lead into the park. The only way to access this remote area is either by chartering a private plane, navigating a dangerous river full of treacherous white rapids, or embarking on a grueling, weeks-long overland hike for those brave enough to undertake the journey. The reward is exploring one of the most pristine and untouched landscapes on Earth. It's truly nature in its most unspoiled form. Over the last 10,000 years, several native tribes have attempted to settle within the Nahanni Valley, only to either flee in terror, claiming they were haunted by large, wolf-like creatures lurking in the forests, known to them as the Wahilas, or to mysteriously vanish without a trace. The Noha tribe, for example, seemingly disappeared overnight, leaving behind all their shelter, food, and supplies. While this may sound like mere folklore, events that occurred in the early 20th century give weight to these eerie stories. In 1898, 6 prospectors gathered their gold mining gear, weapons, and provisions and ventured into the Nahanni Valley in search of riches. The men never returned, and their disappearance was initially considered just another case of people getting lost in the wilderness. However, a few years later, a hunter stumbled upon a small camp, where the authorities later identified the remains of the miners. The most unsettling detail was that their skeletons were found clutching weapons, yet their heads were missing. Strangely, the skulls were neatly stacked at the feet of the bodies. The Canadian Mounted Police attributed the deaths to hypothermia, suggesting that animals had scavenged the bodies and arranged the skulls. This incident was not widely reported and would likely have been forgotten, if not for what happened next. In 1904, 3 brothers Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod decided to venture into the Nahanni Valley in search of gold. They believed that, due to the valley's isolation, any gold hidden there had likely never been discovered. After a long and exhausting journey involving sled dogs and homemade boats, the brothers finally arrived in the valley and found themselves on the Flat River, which runs through the heart of the Nahanni Valley. Despite its name, the Flat River is anything but flat at certain points. It is more like a series of rapids. Regardless, the McLeod brothers navigated the river and eventually set up camp on the riverbank. They decided this would be a good spot to begin their search, so they lowered their gold sluices into the water. A gold sluice is a long, narrow box traditionally made of wood, though modern versions are crafted from lightweight metals. Like aluminum, it has a strainer on one side, and miners would place it in the water, shoveling sediment into it. The strainer would catch larger particles, while the water and smaller debris would flow out, leaving any gold nuggets trapped inside. The 3 brothers began using their sluices, and almost immediately they struck gold. The river was abundant with it, Day and night, they sifted through the gold, and by the following morning, they had filled all their containers. Realizing the potential of the area, they decided to return with their initial find, secure a claim, and come back with more men and equipment. After packing up their camp and loading everything onto the boat, they set off along the flat river. However, at the start of their journey back, disaster struck. The boat capsized and broke apart due to the powerful rapids. They lost most of their supplies and all the gold they had collected. While devastated by the loss of their treasure, they managed to salvage enough to survive. Determined not to give up, they resolved to head back to their original campsite and try again, hoping to gather more gold before returning. They knew the gold was there, they just needed to get out and regroup. Hoping to secure the funds for a larger expedition, using some of the wood salvaged from their shattered boats and cutting down trees, they managed to build another vessel. Once it was finished, they made their way back up the river to their original camp. Unfortunately, this time they couldn't find any gold. Having already lost all their gold and many of their supplies, they spent a frustrating night, exhausted and demoralized, and decided the next morning to abandon their search and leave the valley. The following morning, they packed up once again and cautiously made their way back down the flat river, more wary after their earlier misfortune, eventually making their way out of the valley. When they returned home, Willie and Frank, the younger brothers, were eager to return to the Nahanni Valley. They had confirmed that gold was indeed there, and despite their setbacks, they were determined to continue. However, Charlie, the older brother, felt the boat's capsizing was a near miss, and he decided to stay behind. Instead, Willie and Frank enlisted a third person, a friend named Robert Weir, to join them. They spent the winter making preparations for a longer expedition, planning to bring back as much gold as possible. By the spring of 1905, the three were ready and set off for the valley once again. Weeks turned into months, then a whole year passed, and no word came from them. Charlie assumed they had struck it rich and were surviving off their provisions, as they were all experienced woodsmen. He wasn't overly concerned. However, after another year with no communication, Charlie decided it was time to go and check on them. He gathered 4 local men and organized an expedition to return to the Nahanni Valley and locate his brothers and Robert Weir. After a long and arduous journey, the search party finally reached the flat river. They navigated the dangerous rapids, scanning the banks for any sign of the missing men, but found nothing. They continued down the river until they reached its end, where it meets a much larger river known as the South Nahanni. At this point, the river makes a sharp 45-degree turn, known as the Big Bend, which leads into a 10-mile stretch of river called the Second Canyon. The South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, has 4 canyons, and these are immense, with sheer cliffs rising 3.0 feet on both sides, making the waters in parts of the river just as deep. The Second Canyon is particularly unique because its cliffs are almost vertical, so close to the water that there's almost no shoreline. Once you enter this section, you're essentially trapped, with towering cliffs on both sides and water thousands of feet below. You have no choice but to make it through this stretch before you can take a break. Along the cliffs, there are openings high up that lead to vast cave systems inside the towering rock walls. Because of the difficulty in reaching the Nahanni Valley and the danger in climbing up to these cave openings, no one had ever explored them. As soon as Charlie and his party entered the Second Canyon, the sunlight would have been blocked by the massive cliffs, plunging them into darkness. The wind howled through the canyon, and as they traveled the 10-mile stretch, they would have been looking at small strips of shoreline on both sides for any signs of human activity. However, they saw nothing. As the search party got closer to entering the first canyon, the sides of the river began to widen enough to allow them to beach their boats. Trees lined the shore, and just before they exited the Second Canyon, they spotted something unusual: a tent nestled among the trees. The party made their way to the shoreline, and as they approached the tent, they saw a body lying in front of it. Upon closer inspection, They discovered that the body was missing its head. The clothes were scorched, as if burned, and it appeared that the person had been reaching out with their right arm at the time of death. Just out of their grasp, a rifle was propped up against a tree. Continuing around the body, they moved to the rear of the tent, where they found another body partially inside and partially outside the tent. This body, too, was headless. The search party looked around the camp for a third body or any sign of the missing heads, but they found neither. They eventually summoned the courage to search the first body's pockets and the inside of the tent, where they discovered personal belongings that confirmed the deceased were Charlie's brothers. However, Robert Weir was nowhere to be found. Several months later, a partial skeleton was discovered a little further down the river, presumed to be Robert's, though it was never officially identified. An intriguing detail was found carved into a nearby tree, reading, "We have found a fine prospect," suggesting that Charlie's brothers had indeed discovered gold. But strangely, no gold was found either on the bodies or in their camp, nor was there any trace of the sluices they had brought with them. The search party returned to the valley's entrance and contacted the mounted police, who came to investigate the campsite. The RCMP ultimately concluded that the three men had died from starvation, and after their deaths, animals had taken their heads. Charlie, however, refused to accept the official explanation, doubting that animals had arranged the bodies in the way they had been found. He believed the brothers had been attacked by local native tribes, but the police dismissed this theory. Unlike the earlier incident, the story of these decapitated men made national news. For a time, the public was consumed by the mystery, with many offering their own theories. Some speculated that the skeleton found later might not have belonged to Robert Weir, and that he had murdered the brothers and stolen their gold. Others linked the incident to the previous disappearance of the 6 prospectors. A number of people also brought up the native legends surrounding the valley, suggesting the area was cursed, or that it harbored an undiscovered, possibly prehistoric creature, perhaps a giant wildcat or wolf lurking in the wilderness. The story, combined with the earlier tragic events, instilled widespread fear of the Nahanni Valley. The part of the river near where the brothers had been found was soon dubbed the Valley of Headless Men, a name later shortened to the Headless Valley. The name, while descriptive, also became eerily prophetic. Despite the fear generated by the public hysteria surrounding the deaths of the MacLeod brothers, the legend of hidden gold in the Nahanni Valley took root. Many people began referring to the area as the Canadian El Dorado, and in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen, undeterred by the terrifying stories, set out to find the treasure. He braved the arduous overland journey to the Nahanni Valley, and eventually found a location about 70 miles upstream from the Headless Valley, along the Flat River. Martin Jorgensen, determined to stay through the winter, built a modest one-room cabin, planning to meet his business partners in Yellowknife the following summer. After completing his cabin and setting up his prospecting tools, he traveled downstream to send word to his partners, claiming he had struck it rich. Naturally, his partners were eager to join him and begin preparations for their journey back into the valley. The following summer, however, when summer came around, Martin never appeared. His partners waited for several weeks, but after nearly 2 months without any word, they decided they needed to venture into the valley to check on him. Hiring a native guide, they made their way up the Flat River, heading toward the area where Martin had indicated he would be. They eventually found his cabin, or what remained of it. Jorgensen's cabin had been destroyed by fire, and beside the charred remnants of the structure, they discovered the burned remains of a body once again, headless. The authorities conducted a thorough investigation, but they were unable to determine the exact cause of Martin's death. They dismissed any connection between his death and the earlier deaths of the MacLeod brothers, despite the decapitation, attributing it to animals scavenging the body. As with the previous incidents, no gold was found at Martin's cabin, despite the police's assurances that the two events were unrelated. Martin's death quickly became headline news, and it stirred public interest once again. But Martin Jorgensen wouldn't be the last to venture into the treacherous Nahanni Valley. In search of fortune, the lure of gold proved stronger than the cautionary tales, and 7 years later, in 1921, trapper John O'Brien, a seasoned woodsman, was found frozen to death in the Nahanni Valley, just a few miles upstream from the Headless Valley. While this in itself might not have been remarkable, it was the unusual circumstances surrounding his discovery that caught the authorities' attention. O'Brien was found standing in front of what had clearly been a campfire. He didn't appear to be hunched over or in pain, nor was there any indication of distress or fear on his face. He was even holding a box of matches, as though he had been sitting calmly by the fire when something had caused him to freeze in place. Witnesses remarked that it appeared as though he had been frozen almost instantly, as if by lightning. This didn't make sense given his vast experience in the wilderness, and it was difficult to comprehend why he hadn't reacted to the sudden freeze. Despite the strange circumstances, the death of a trapper in the harsh Canadian wilderness was not deemed suspicious, and the authorities did not pursue further investigation. In 1926, 5 years later, an even stranger event occurred. A Métis girl named May Lafferty vanished while on a hunting trip in the Nahanni Valley. Her disappearance remains one of the most mysterious and puzzling episodes in the valley's history. May Lafferty, the younger cousin of Paul Feld's wife, Mary, was known to be a peculiar little girl. According to one forester, she was neurotic. That summer, she accompanied Paul, Mary, and a group of natives from Fort Simpson on a hunting trip to the Nahanni Valley. The group had spent the winter fishing in the Mackenzie Mountains and was heading to one of the trading posts along the Laird River. One day, while following an old Indian trail on the southern branch of the river later known as the Merry River, May suddenly disappeared. At first, it was assumed she had simply wandered off into the bushes to relieve herself, and her absence went unnoticed. But as time passed, Mary became increasingly worried, fearing that something had happened to her young cousin. Eventually, Paul set out into the wilderness with 5 experienced native hunters: Diamond C, Boston Jack, Charlie Johan, George Tessu, and Big Charlie. The trackers quickly picked up May's trail and followed it into the dense woods. At first, it seemed like the young girl had simply lost her way. However, as they moved deeper into the forest, the hunters found themselves struggling to keep pace with May's trail. Her delicate moccasin prints suggested she had been darting through the wilderness, like the wind itself. Paul and his companions followed the trail for a grueling 9 days, during which they discovered pieces of May's torn clothing hanging from tree branches. At irregular intervals, it appeared that as she ran, the Métis girl had gradually shed her clothes, leaving them behind until she was completely naked. The mosquitoes in the area at that time of year were overwhelming, making it almost impossible for anyone to survive unprotected. Yet, despite the odds, May's trail continued winding up into the mountains. Paul and his party pressed on for another 4 days, but eventually they were forced to give up. May's body was never found, even though it seemed improbable that she could have survived for over a week, alone and naked, in the freezing wilderness. But the strangest part of the story came months later, when Paul and his party returned to civilization and shared their account with the authorities. The tale made its way into local newspapers. Shortly after, a hunter who only identified himself as Charlie came forward with an unsettling story of his own. While hunting near Third Canyon, he had set up camp on the shores of Flat River. Late one evening, he was woken by the sound of rocks splashing into the water. In the moonlight, he saw a naked girl on all fours, scrambling up the side of a cliff. He described her movements as animal-like, and recalled how she would stop intermittently to look around, her face frozen in a rictus grin, her eyes wide and wild. The sight disturbed him deeply, but he dismissed it as a dream until he later heard the story of May Lafferty's disappearance, and realized the eerie encounter had occurred around the same time, and in a similar location. Despite his unsettling experience, the police dismissed Charlie's account. They insisted that no one could survive naked in the mountains. so they never pursued the investigation further. In memory of May Lafferty, the creek where she vanished was named May Creek. Another strange and mysterious figure who roamed the Nahanni Valley was the legendary Yukon fisherman. Fisher was a giant of a man who had traveled to the Klondike along the treacherous Ashford Trail after a violent altercation with a bartender in a Yukon saloon, in which Fisher believed he had killed the man. He vanished into the wilderness. For years, the Yukon Fisher lived as a hermit, avoiding both native tribes and white settlers alike. He became a near mythical figure, known for surviving in complete isolation. On rare occasions, he would venture to remote trading posts, like Paul Field's store at Ross River, to stock up on essentials before disappearing back into the wild. Paul Field, who had more interactions with Fisher than anyone else, described him as having the senses of a wild animal, able to distinguish between the footsteps of a moose, caribou, bear, or human with ease. In April of 1929, 3 prospectors J. Gilroy, Andy Hay, and Angus Hall entered the Nahanni Valley, driven by the promise of gold. They decided to take an unorthodox route, boating their way up the Laird River and into the South Nahanni, passing through Fort Nelson. They made it to the South Nahanni by May, only to be caught by flash floods. The trio braved the waters, managing to make it beyond Second Canyon to the mouth of Scow Creek before their motor broke down. Undeterred, they paddled to shore and continued their journey on foot. After setting up camp, tensions flared, and Angus Hall stormed off into the woods in anger. His companions saw him climb up a long valley, expecting him to return after a while to cool off. When nightfall came and Hall still hadn't returned, they weren't overly concerned, assuming he'd simply wandered farther in the woods. But when morning came and there was still no sign of Hall, they began to worry. They continued up Bennett Creek, where they found a single footprint, a hobnailed boot, identical to those worn by their missing companion. Gilroy and Hay met up with another group of prospectors, Fred Hassler, Billy Hill, W. Cochran, and George Spangler, and after sharing a meal, the 2 groups set out to search for Hall. They found no trace of him. The body of Angus Hall was never found. The single footprint was the only clue, and it seemed as though he had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. 1 year after Angus Hall's disappearance, another trapper, Phil Powers, ventured into the Nahanni Valley. Known for his ruggedness and competence as a frontiersman, Powers hailed from Fort Nelson. He set up a cabin at the mouth of Irvine Creek, across the flat river from Old Pot Hot Springs, and established a trapline. However, something sinister awaited Powers. Far from the spot where Martin Jorgensen met his mysterious end, a disturbing discovery was made. Skeletons of lynxes and foxes, caught in traps but never tended, hinted that something had gone terribly wrong. As they continued on their journey toward the confluence of the Caribou and Flat Rivers, they found the remains of Powers' 22-foot canoe, a tragic sign of abandonment. But it wasn't until they reached the mouth of Irvine Creek, where Powers' cabin once stood, that the true horror was revealed. The cabin, like Jorgensen's, had burned to the ground. Among the ashes were the charred remains of Phil Powers. There are conflicting accounts about the condition of his body. Some reports suggest that Powers' head was missing, with his skeleton still clutching a 6-shooter revolver, while others state that his skull was found at his feet. The RCMP investigators theorized that a faulty stovepipe caused the fire, but seasoned prospectors questioned this explanation. Powers, an experienced prospector, would have ensured his cabin was built properly to avoid such a mishap. Furthermore, if the stovepipe had ignited the roof, it should have caused a less intense fire, yet the fire that destroyed Powers' cabin had burned so hot that only the bottom log remained, and the trapper's cache was untouched, except for empty gasoline cans. Some speculated that someone had shot Powers while he lay on his bunk, then set his cabin on fire to cover the crime. The mystery surrounding Powers' death added to the growing legend of the Nahanni Valley. The men had brought canvas to fashion into a watercraft for their return down the South Nahanni River in the spring, but when spring came, The two trappers never returned. Joe Mulholland's brother, Jack, first noticed their absence and, after speaking to Epler's associates, organized a search. Dalziel, the same pilot who had flown the trappers into the valley, agreed to help. He took the search party to the area where he'd originally dropped the men off. There, they discovered the remains of a cabin, once again burned to the ground, just like Martin Jorgensen's and Phil Power's cabins. Despite searching the area for several days, no sign of Mulholland or Epler was found. The only clues were the charred remains of their shelter, and the search party eventually had to leave, though other attempts to find the missing men followed. A few months later, in May of 1936, a group of hunters who had been camping at Irvine Creek arrived at the mouth of the Flat River. They discovered a fresh campfire, only a few days old, near the confluence of the Flat and Nahanni rivers. As they continued down the South Nahanni River, they noticed several trees felled by axes. Since Mulholland and Epler had been the only known people in the valley at the time, it was assumed that these were their last traces. But the mystery deepened as the following winter, two hunters, Al Lewis and Harry Van Dale, ventured into the valley and found a series of odd camps near Rabbit Kettle Lake, located at the northern tip of the Nahanni. The camps were unusual in that they contained neatly folded tarps, with various items stacked on top: tobacco cans, wolf legs, and other strange artifacts. These caches were spaced out randomly, far from the usual patterns of prospectors and trappers. The oddity of the caches made Lewis question whether they were more than just the remnants of a simple trapper's journey. The mystery surrounding these strange occurrences and disappearances began to form a pattern. The Nahanni Valley, with its eerie history of decapitations, unexplained deaths, and odd behavior from both nature and men alike, began to cultivate a reputation not only for being a land rich with gold, but also for being a place where the unknown and possibly malevolent forces seemed to thrive. In 1940, the Edmonton Journal reported the mysterious death of an aeronautical engineer named William Gilbertson, whose body was discovered in his cabin somewhere within the Nahanni Valley. Details surrounding Gilbertson and the circumstances of his death remain sparse. That same year, another man, a frontiersman named Ollie Holmberg, vanished in the Nahanni Valley, further deepening the area's mysterious reputation. In 1945, Walter J. Tully embarked on a prospecting journey to the Nahanni Valley with two companions, but their expedition was abruptly halted when they stumbled upon a decomposed body of a man in a sleeping bag on the banks of the Flat River. The man's head had been severed. After investigating, the RCMP identified the remains as those of Ernest Savard, a 40-year-old French-Canadian prospector well known in Northwest Territories trading posts. The authorities concluded that hunger had likely driven Savard to exhaustion, prompting him to crawl into his sleeping bag, where he ultimately died. Animals, unable to reach the rest of his body, had gnawed on his severed head. In the fall of 1946, prospector Frank Henderson returned from the Nahanni Valley, bringing with him 30 ounces of gold and an eerie tale to tell. Henderson, the nephew of Robert Henderson, one of the trio who discovered gold in the Klondike, had spent much of his life prospecting in the rugged Canadian wilderness. Despite his extensive experience, he appeared visibly shaken when recounting his tale to journalist George Murray of Fort St. John. Henderson had planned to prospect with his longtime partner, John Patterson, at Watson Lake, Yukon, located near the Laird River, northwest of Low Post, BC. Patterson, a man with significant experience in the backcountry, was known among traders in Vancouver and Calgary, and had reportedly worked as an advisor for the construction of the Alaska Highway. The two men had arranged to meet at Virginia Falls in the spring of 1946, and then proceed to Watson Lake together. Henderson arrived from the Northwest Territories side, traveling by dog sled with 5 First Nations guides, while Patterson was making his way from the east via the Mackenzie River. As was customary between them, they left carved messages in trees at specific points along the trail. When Henderson arrived at the meeting place first and Patterson did not appear on time, Henderson left a message on the tree and proceeded further into the valley, assuming Patterson had been delayed. That night, Henderson was awoken by strange, eerie wails. They had set up camp on a rock ledge about half a mile from the river, and the sounds appeared to emanate from the riverbed. His First Nations guides were already awake, clearly alarmed, and gestured for him to remain silent and still. They hurriedly extinguished the fire and covered it with a pot. The eerie wailing persisted 4 hours. Once it stopped, Henderson was able to coax a reluctant explanation from his guides, who spoke of having seen white giants near the river. Henderson never forgot the haunting sounds, which he described as unlike anything he had ever heard from either animal or human. Clearly spooked, Henderson's guides insisted on detouring eastward out of the valley rather than continuing along the South Nahanni River, intending to meet Patterson along a different route. Along the way, Henderson found a message carved by Patterson into a tree, confirming that Patterson had entered the valley. Henderson wanted to return and search for Patterson, but his guides refused to go back into the valley. When Patterson failed to meet him by August, Henderson decided to search for his partner in the valley on his own. His guides remained adamant in their refusal to enter the valley, so Henderson ventured alone. He spent the rest of the summer in the valley, searching for Patterson, but never encountered the mysterious white figures that had terrified his guides. As he said, "All summer, I moved with utmost caution, mostly at night." Despite his efforts, Patterson was never found. Author Pierre Burton later wrote that Frank Henderson, a man with personal reasons to discourage others from entering the valley, had said upon his return, "There is absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of that whole valley." Most accounts of the curse of the Nahanni Valley end with the tale of Ukrainian trapper John Shebok, who bizarrely starved to death despite being an experienced hunter, and his body found less than a mile upriver from a well-stocked cabin he certainly knew about. Shebok's corpse was found mutilated. "It was just a mess," claimed Gus Kraus, a guide hired by the RCMP when they carried out their investigation into the death. Scraps of clothing and bones had been gnawed and dragged around, apparently by the very wildlife that the area was teeming with, that Shebok was unable to catch. A journal was found near Shebok's corpse, most of it unreadable due to exposure to the elements. But authorities were able to make out the final entry, dated February 3, 1946, which just said that this was the 43rd day since Shebok had last eaten. In and of itself a nearly unbelievable claim. However, deaths and disappearances associated with the valley continued to be reported. In 1957, Leonard Brunchnik entered the Nahanni Valley in search of the lost McLeod gold mine. Several months later, his body was found on the shelf of a cutbank of the South Nahanni, lying face down in a mat of dried blood and vomit. In 1962, a pilot named Angus Blake Mackenzie disappeared while flying over the valley. An RCAF search and rescue team set out to look for him, but after 40 days, no trace was found and he was given up for dead. That same year, a bush pilot named Kenneth Stockwell flew 3 men named Victor Houdon, Gunther Gortz, and Henry Buss into the Nahanni Valley for an expedition. Months later, the remains of Stockwell's plane and the corpse of Victor Houdon were discovered near Virginia Falls. The bodies of Stockwell, Gortz, and Buss were never found. On June 22, 1963, 3 Swiss canoeists, named Martin Wuthrick, Fritz Weissman, and Wolfgang Minke set down the South Nahanni River in a canoe. In early August, a Mountie patrol found the body of Martin Wuthrick, trapped beneath a wall of the Figure 8 Rapids with a poncho wrapped around his head. The corpse was in a state of almost complete preservation due to the icy water, but the cause of death could not be established, as he apparently died before entering the water, rather than drowning. Weissman and Minke were never found. In 1980, German magazine Spiegel became enamored with the stories and decided to finance a new research expedition to the ominous valley. The management of the publishing house hired 3 former US airborne troops. Their task was to stay in the Valley of the Headless for a month, documenting everything that happened. However, Despite possessing combat experience and practical skills to survive in extreme conditions, the team soon found they faced insurmountable difficulties. 2 days after arriving in the Headless Valley, the former paratroopers sent a radiogram, which said that the valley and they themselves are enveloped and tightened by something like a fog. After that, the connection with the detachment was interrupted and the veterans disappeared without a trace. A rescue team was sent to help the paratroopers, but it also disappeared. The oldest stories of the Nahanni come from the traditions of the Dean tribes. The Dean people are an indigenous group of First Nations who inhabit the northern boreal and Arctic regions of Canada. The Dean speak Northern Athabascan languages. Dean is the common Athabascan word for people. According to Dean tradition, in ancient times, the Nahanni Valley was inhabited by a nomadic, warlike tribe known as the Naha. The Naha were ferocious warriors who frequently descended from their mountain homes to raid Dean settlements in the lowlands surrounding the Liard and Mackenzie rivers, carrying away women and supplies. After suffering a number of devastating incursions, a conglomeration of several Dean tribes banded together to travel into the Nahanni and take revenge upon the Naha. The large group of braves took to the warpath, traveling into Nahanni country. They sent scouts to find the Naha settlement in the mountains. They found it by going through Horseshoe Canyon nearby to Dare Prairie Creek, a secluded, difficult to access location. The Dean scouts returned and fetched their warriors and then lay in wait until nightfall, preparing their attack. In the middle of the night they surrounded the Naha settlement on all sides, sneaking closer and ready to strike. Once they were right alongside the teepees, they hurriedly threw open the tent flaps, weapons at the ready and no one was inside. Silence. Fires were smoldering, sleeping bags were laid out, but there wasn't a single human around. They had disappeared completely. The Dean, fearful, quickly retreated from the area and marked the lands as cursed. The Naha were never heard from again. Present-day similarities between local Dean dialects and the Navajo language in the southern United States has led to speculation that the Navajo are possibly descendants of the missing Naha. As the eerie tales of headless corpses and mysterious deaths in the Nahanni Valley spread during the early 1900s, some theorized that the Naha tribe had somehow survived in the area, living in isolation within the vast and unexplored cave systems of Second Canyon. This tribe was said to be xenophobic, violent, and composed of primitive headhunters. Millions of years ago, the Logocho sunbird and ragged ranges rose around the South Nahanni, sheltering it from the massive destructive ice sheets that reformed the landscape of North America. Through the 4 ice ages of the Pleistocene epoch, thanks to its unique geological structure, Nahanni Valley has remained untouched by glaciation for at least 100,000 years. Over the centuries, this secluded area in the Mackenzie Mountains has become a refuge for a vast array of flora and fauna, some of which left behind fossil traces of their existence. In fact, the region is believed by some to hold the oldest known fossil evidence of animal life on Earth, including the recent discovery of an 890-million-year-old sponge-like animal fossil. Interestingly, both native and frontier myths suggest that some descendants of the prehistoric creatures that once roamed the Nahanni Valley, including massive Pleistocene beasts, may have survived into relatively recent times. In many of his articles about the Nahanni Valley, Philip Godsall recounts the story of Frank Worth Beaton, a Scotsman who left the Orkney Islands at 17 to join the Hudson Bay Company, and later became the chief factor of Fort St. John until 1945. Beaton oversaw numerous geographical, geological, and natural studies of the area in the early 20th century. One such group of scientists encountered a native guide named Chiquina, who shared a tale from his father. According to Chiquina's father, he had once traveled north to the river country, where he met a primitive tribe armed with bone-shard javelins and clubs made from moose jawbones. Around their fires, these Stone Age people spoke of a medicine valley further north, inhabited by monstrous creatures of enormous size and ferocity. One of the father's new Dean companions produced a scrap of buckskin from his medicine bag, upon which was burned an image of one of these beasts. The father kept a charm for many years, eventually passing it down to his son. Chikina showed the charm to the scientific party, who were astounded to realize that the image on the buckskin was of a dinosaur, drawn with striking anatomical accuracy. This story is not entirely far-fetched. Several dinosaur skeletons have been discovered in the Northwest Territories, especially around the Bear Rock sinkhole, formed by the collapse of an ancient cave system. Dean tribes from across the northern regions, from the eastern shores of the Mackenzie River to the forests of Alaska, have long spoken of mysterious wildmen that harass them at night, often lurking in the shadows just beyond the campfire's light. These wildmen were as real to the Dean as wolves or ravens, and the tribes went to great lengths to avoid crossing paths with them. Father Emile Petito, a 19th century Oblate missionary who lived among the Slavey and Sota Dean, was one of the first to write about these wildmen. In 1876, Petito described a fear that spread among the Dean every summer. Akin to an epidemic, they live at times in continual terror of an imaginary enemy who pursues them without rest and whom they believe to see everywhere, even though he doesn't exist at all. According to ethnographer Cornelius B. Osgood, belief in the Nokoni wildman was still strong among the Dean as late as 1929. When the Dean suspected that a Nokoni was nearby, entire bands would often abandon their camps and take refuge on an island in a nearby lake, believing the creature could not cross to their new campsite. On other occasions, according to Hudson's Bay Company trader John Firth, whole encampments would stand their ground and fire muskets into the forest, chasing away the supposed intruders. B.R. Ross, another Hudson's Bay Company trader, recounted in his 1879 report notes on the Tinna or Chipewyan Indians of British and Russian America, how even a strange footprint or unusual sound in the forest would cause immense panic among the Dean. At Fort Resolution, I have on several occasions caused all the natives encamped around to flock for protection into the fort during the night simply by whistling, hidden in the bushes. Ross wrote, "My train of hauling dogs, also a large breed of great hunters, would, in crashing through the branches in pursuit of an unfortunate hare, frighten some women out gathering berries, who would rush in frantic haste to the tents and fearfully relate a horrific account of some strange painted Indians whom they had seen." Ross also mentioned how, during the wildfall season, the Dean warned him of the dangers of sleeping outside. The Nokoni, according to various accounts, were said to possess the terrifying ability to uproot entire birch trees from the ground, roots and all, using only their bare hands. Philip Godsall, who spent considerable time among Dean campfires as an inspector for the Hudson's Bay Company, described the Nokoni as troglodytes, twice the size of ordinary humans, who went about naked except for a layer of foul-smelling hair. In some of his writings, Godsall even compared them to gorillas and gargoyles, remarking on their superhuman strength and speed. An article titled "Cursed Treasure of Deadman's Valley," published in Saga magazine, depicted the Nokoni as hairy demons standing as tall as a Kodiak bear, as swift as a bird in flight, and killing all they can by severing their victims' heads. Their skin was said to be so tough that bullets couldn't pierce it, and cutting through it with a knife was more difficult than slicing through stone. Numerous frontiersmen described the immense size of the Nokoni's footprints, which they found in the snow and mesquite. These tracks were said to resemble human footprints, but were longer and narrower, with some accounts noting that the big toe stood out distinctly from the other toes. The Dean long believed that the Nokoni inhabited the Nahani Valley, residing in its dark caves and canyons. This belief is reflected in the region's toponymy. The term Nordi, an ancient Dean word for the South Nahani River, translates to River of Giants. According to Dean language expert Alan Adam, Nokoni attacks were said to occur mostly during the spring, summer, and early autumn. During the harsh, bitterly cold subarctic winters, however, there were no reports of Nokoni encounters. The Dean were uncertain where the Nokoni retreated to during the winter. Some claimed the creatures dug burrows in the permafrost, hibernating like bears, while others believed they migrated south to areas where their kind were more numerous. The Nokoni were believed to stalk and hunt traveling natives, hiding in the brush and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Often, the only sign of their presence would be the discovery of strange tracks in the forest or a fleeting glimpse of their dark figure. In some cases, their victims felt an unnerving sensation of being watched. When the Nokoni targeted a camp, they would often remain just beyond the light of the fire, waiting silently. Sometimes, they would taunt their prey by throwing rocks or sticks, or making strange sounds, whistles, laughter, or eerie howling wails that resembled the wind passing through the mountains. In rare instances, victims, often young women, would narrowly escape the Nokoni's clutches and live to tell their story. Those who survived often reported a strong, nauseating odor preceding the attack, and some described a sense of overwhelming dread, as if the Nokoni had somehow exerted a hypnotic or supernatural influence over them. An alternative version of the Nokoni legend, recorded by ethnologists studying the Dene, portrays them not as enormous, hairy creatures, but rather as wild, disheveled Indians. According to Dene informants, the Nokoni were individuals who had turned savage after committing murder or cannibalism. Years of living in the wilderness had transformed them into frightening, grotesque figures. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies emaciated from malnutrition, and their skin often caked in dirt and grease. Their clothing was tattered and strange, often incomplete or mismatched. One account mentioned a Nokoni carrying a knife and wearing only hard-soled shoes, made from untanned hide, and a headscarf. This version of the Nokoni shares similarities with the Wendigo legend, a mythical creature in Algonquian folklore known for its association with cannibalism and madness. Paul Field, writing on the Nokoni, theorized that the legend was likely a relic from a time when the Dene tribes were in constant conflict with one another. In trying to trace down the origins of the stories, I concluded that it was born in the old days when tribes would raid one another, stealing valuables, women, and children, he wrote. While this practice died out after Dawson and the country was policed, some younger men, and even some older ones, continued to make hunting trips into lands claimed by other tribes. In these cases, they would sometimes hang around enemy camps at night, capturing young girls and taking them back to their own tribes. According to Field, these raids may have contributed to the Nokoni myth, with tribes using the fear of the Nokoni to terrorize their enemies. Even if they did not actually commit the most heinous acts, the Nokoni sightings continue to occur with surprising regularity in the wilderness of northern Canada, even in recent years. One such encounter was reported by Tony Wilaya, a Dogrib native from Hawaii, Northwest Territories. On July 28, 2016, the CBC published an article detailing his chilling experience while boating on Lac La Martre, a large body of water near the Great Slave and Great Bear Lakes. Wilaya had an unfortunate encounter when he attempted to retrieve a plastic bag floating in the water. A rogue wave capsized his boat, and he found himself immersed in the frigid water. Struggling to right his vessel, he decided to swim to the nearest island. Exhausted and cold, Wilaya finally managed to reach the island and crawl onto the rocky shore. But his ordeal had just begun. All of a sudden, he recalled, there was a big man standing beside me. The figure quickly disappeared into the forest, but Wilaya had the distinct sense that someone or something was watching him from the trees. He spent the next 48 hours alone on the island, terrified and unable to sleep, certain that whatever had appeared near him was lurking just out of sight. Eventually, a rescue party from the RCMP and Canadian military located him on July 19, 2016, and he was taken to the Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife. Wilaya made a full recovery, but never fully overcame the terror of those 2 days, alone on the island. In addition to the Nokoni, another legendary creature from the Nahanni Valley is the Wahila, an enormous, white, wolf-like beast. This creature is said to be the size of a full-grown bear, with long, pure white fur. The term Wahila was coined by cryptozoologist Ivan Sanderson, who based it on a description from his colleague Frank Graves. In 1965, Graves surveyed the Nahanni Valley, hunting for Bigfoot, and during his expedition, he encountered the creature. Graves traveled through the Deco region and up the South Nahanni River to the Kraus Hot Springs, located about 60 kilometers upriver from Nahanni Butte. The area, which is inaccessible by road and is described as a secret paradise, contains tropical vegetation that is rare in the Canadian North. The hot springs themselves are a cryptozoologist's dream, and some believe they could even house surviving prehistoric species, including dinosaurs. While passing through a dangerous area called the Splitzer Labyrinth of Islands and Log Jams, where many canoeists had met their demise, Graves stumbled upon something entirely unexpected. He described seeing an enormous white thing that he initially mistook for a polar bear. However, upon closer inspection, it was clear that the creature was not a bear, but something more akin to a giant wolf or dog. It stood on long legs, and despite being about 20 times the size of any wolf Graves had ever seen, it seemed unfazed by the presence of the human hunters. Graves fired 2 shots at the creature from close range, but the creature did not react in the way one might expect from a wounded animal. Instead, it simply turned away and calmly walked back into the forest. Graves, convinced that he had hit it, reloaded and fired again, but the creature just continued its walk. His companion, a local native, identified the animal as a ghost wolf, a figure that appears in numerous native legends across northern Ontario and Alaska. Some cryptozoologists believe the creature Graves encountered was a descendant of the Amphicyonidae, often referred to as bear dogs, a prehistoric family of carnivores that existed millions of years ago. Although the exact origin of the term Wahila is unclear, Sanderson's use of it has persisted, and it remains the name most commonly associated with this mysterious beast. The Wahila has even appeared in popular culture, such as the animated series The Secret Saturdays, the reality television show Alaska Monsters, and the encrypted book series, where Wahila are depicted as therianthropes creatures capable of shifting between human and giant bear dog forms. These stories and sightings continue to capture the imagination of both locals and cryptozoologists alike, with the Wahila and Nahanni remaining at the forefront of the many mysteries surrounding the Nahanni Valley and the remote wilderness of northern Canada. As the years pass, the legends of the Nahanni and the Wahila persist, woven into the fabric of the wilderness and the lives of those who call the Canadian North home. Despite the numerous sightings and encounters, no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to confirm the existence of these creatures. The vast, uncharted expanse of the Nahanni Valley, with its labyrinthine canyons and dense forests, remains a place of mystery and intrigue. The few who venture deep into this remote land return with stories that blur the line between fact and folklore, each one adding another layer to the enigma. The Wahila, elusive as the shadows that stretch across the valley, continues to evade capture, and the Nahanni, if they are real, seem to dwell just beyond the reach of human understanding, hidden in the depths of the wilderness, leaving only whispers and strange footprints in the snow. For now, the wilderness holds its secrets tightly, and the creatures of the Nahanni remain as they have for centuries, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of knowledge, forever lingering at the edge of the unknown. The truth, it seems, is something that may never be fully revealed, and perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all.